The year was 1945. The Pacific War was dying, though no one yet dared to believe it. Japan's empire had shrunk to a wounded island nation, its soldiers surrendering in scattered pockets across Asia and the Pacific. Thousands of civilians, clerks, nurses, and wives who had followed the army, were caught in the retreat. Among them was a small group of women who would soon cross an ocean they had never dreamed of, riding into the heart of Texas under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow their fear whole. They left Yokohama under guard, silent as ghosts. Some were in their 20s, some scarcely older than girls, their hair pinned back with the precision of another life. They had been trained to expect brutality if captured. Newspapers had said Americans shot prisoners, soldiers whispered of torture. When the transport ship rolled on the dark Pacific, several clutched each other, whispering prayers to gods they weren't sure were listening. One, a young nurse named Keiko, held a pocket-sized photograph of her younger brother in uniform. She feared she might never see him or her homeland again. Others said nothing at all, their faces masks against the unknown. Weeks later, after rail and truck and endless waiting in military depots, the women found themselves deep in the American South. The Texas heat was unlike anything they had known. Dry, searing, tasting of dust and sunlight. From the slatted backs of military trucks they watched endless plains slip by, broken by the dark silhouettes of mesquite trees and distant oil derricks. The horizon seemed too far away to be real. The guard said little, but their voices were strange music, a low drawl, slow and unhurried, with words the women barely recognized. Inside the truck, the air was heavy with sweat and quiet terror. Keiko kept her gaze low, expecting at any moment to be chained or humiliated. A clerk named Aiko, older and sharper, muttered to the woman beside her that Americans were unpredictable. It was safer to stay invisible. They had been told they were prisoners of war, and in every memory of such prisoners there were images of men dragged in ropes, of cruelty masked as justice. None of them could imagine that the road ahead led to something different. As the convoy approached its destination, the truck slowed and turned off the main road. Dust rose behind them in golden plumes. The women braced, clutching the sides of the benches, when the vehicles finally stopped. Soldiers jumped down first, boots crunching on dry gravel. Then the women were ordered to disembark. They obeyed quietly, eyes down, hands trembling as they stepped into the blinding Texas sun. What they saw waiting stunned them. Not cages, not iron chains, but horses. Dozens of them, restless and shining in the heat, reins held loosely by men in broad hats and boots. These were not the crisp uniformed soldiers the women expected. These were cowboys, or something very much like the picture books they had once seen of the American West. Some leaned casually in their saddles, others swung down with easy grace. Spurs glinted on their heels. Rifles slung from shoulders seemed more like tools than threats. One man, tall and sunburned, tipped his hat in a silent greeting that none of the women dared return. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. Keiko blinked against the sun, certain she was misunderstanding. A horse snorted and pawed at the earth, the sound startling in the quiet. Then an officer spoke in slow, clear English, gesturing toward the animals. The translation came haltingly. The terrain ahead wasn't fit for trucks, the women would ride. There was no mockery in his tone, no relish in their fear, just a matter-of-fact practicality. It was safer this way, faster. The women stared. Horses were not common in wartime Japan. Few of them had ever ridden one. To be placed on horseback by an enemy instead of shackled, it made no sense. Aiko's lips parted in shock. Another woman whispered something half prayer, half curse. A soldier gestured gently for them to approach. One cowboy stepped forward and, seeing their hesitation, gave a small, patient smile. The moment was absurd enough that even fear seemed to falter. Mounting was awkward. Dresses snagged. Sandals slipped. One woman nearly toppled when the horse shifted, and a cowboy caught her arm with quiet steadiness, as if helping a neighbor instead of an enemy. A few soldiers chuckled under their breath, not cruelly, but as men do when something unexpected happens. The air, tense moments before, loosened slightly. Keiko, gripping the saddle horn so tightly her knuckles went white, felt a strange jolt of humiliation and relief. She was frightened, yes, but she was also upright, unchained, moving under her own will. As the procession set off, the world changed. The truck stayed behind, engines ticking in the heat, while the mounted group began its slow trek along a dusty trail toward the camp. The horses' hooves beat a steady rhythm. Dust rose around them like ghostly banners. The cowboys rode with easy confidence, some humming tunelessly, others keeping watch with relaxed eyes. The women clung to their saddles, unused to the sway and lift of the animals. Some trembled, some, gradually, found their balance. Overhead, a hawk traced wide circles against an impossibly blue sky. No one spoke for a long time. But the silence was different now, less of terror, more of stunned disbelief. Aiko risked a glance at the man riding beside her, a lean figure with a weathered face and quiet eyes. He didn't look cruel. He looked, she thought unexpectedly, like a farmer back home might look after a long harvest day, tired but not unkind. When their eyes met briefly, he gave a single, small nod. She looked away quickly, unsure what such a gesture meant, but something in her chest shifted. The trail wound past scrub and cactus, the smell of earth and sun strong in the air. Heat shimmered, and the horses snorted in rhythm. Gradually, the fear that had clenched the women began to loosen, though none dared admit it aloud. They had expected iron. They had found leather. They had expected hatred. They found, at least for now, a strange and wordless civility. By the time the group reached the outskirts of the camp, low barracks ringed with barbed wire, guard towers in the distance, the women were exhausted. Yet something had changed. Their enemy had not spit on them, nor struck them, nor bound them. They had been allowed to ride. It was not kindness exactly, not in the way one gives to friends, but it was not cruelty either. And for people prepared to be stripped of all dignity, that difference felt enormous. As they dismounted, legs shaking, some cowboys offered quiet assistance, a hand to steady, a murmured word. One joked softly in English, drawing a confused but startled laugh from one of the women, the first sound of mirth since capture. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the plains in deep orange light. For a moment, the scene looked almost like peace, enemies and captives sharing the same twilight. Keiko felt tears threaten as she stepped down. Not of joy, nothing about this was joyful, but of disorientation. She had braced for humiliation, prepared herself to lose even her name. Instead, she had been treated, if not gently, then with a practical respect she hadn't imagined possible. The photograph of her brother was still in her pocket. She touched it and wondered, for the first time, if everything she had been told about these people was wrong. The gates of the camp loomed ahead, barbed and cold. Behind them, a new life of captivity awaited, but so did an unexpected truth. The enemy was not what she had been taught to fear. Something more complicated, more human, was unfolding here under the Texas sun. She didn't know it yet, but this small act, a horse instead of chains, would begin to crack the iron walls built by years of propaganda and war. And what waited inside those fences would challenge everything she believed about victory, defeat, and the strange, stubborn dignity that can survive even the cruelest of wars. The camp looked stark from the outside, a rectangle of barbed wire and watchtowers planted in the middle of the Texas plains, but inside it was strangely alive. When the Japanese women first crossed its threshold, they moved in wary silence, their footsteps crunching over dry soil, their eyes scanning the rows of low wooden barracks. The air smelled of sun-warmed pine and dust. Armed guards patrolled casually, their rifles slung low, yet there was no shouting, no deliberate humiliation. After the surreal horseback arrival, the women had braced for the kindness to end. Instead, the world inside was quieter, more puzzling. Keiko walked with the others into a barracks that would be theirs. The walls were bare but clean. Simple cots lined each side. She could hear the faint murmur of men somewhere else in the camp. German POWs, they later learned, housed separately. The guards gave brief instructions in clipped English, translated haltingly by an interpreter. Meals at the mess hall, work assignments to come, rules about curfew and boundaries. Then they left, the door closing softly rather than slamming. The women stood frozen for a moment, trying to understand what was expected. In war, rules could shift like sand. Here, the boundaries felt strangely clear. The first days were still heavy with fear. The women worked in silence. Laundry, mending, tending to small gardens the camp allowed them to keep. They whispered among themselves at night, wondering if this gentleness was a trap. Aiko, sharper and older, advised caution. "Kindness can change in an instant," she murmured one evening, voice barely audible over the creak of beds. Yet she admitted privately that the food was better than expected. Plain beans and bread, sometimes meat, always enough to keep hunger from gnawing. Even small mercies felt disorienting. What unsettled them most was the guards' demeanor. These Texans, some soldiers, some ranch hands enlisted for camp duty, were neither cruel nor deferential. They treated the women with a pragmatic respect, keeping rules firm but not vindictive. When one young prisoner dropped a bucket and scattered water across the walkway, a guard simply handed it back and pointed. No blow, no scream. Aiko, watching, felt her chest tighten with a confusion she didn't want to name. Keiko, meanwhile, was drawn to the horses kept at the camp's edge. The animals were used for patrols and supply runs, and the cowboys often tended them in the evenings. One twilight, she lingered nearby, drawn by the rhythmic sound of brushing and the earthy scent of sweat and leather. A tall cowboy with sunburned cheeks noticed and gave a small nod, then went back to his work without a word. Something about his lack of curiosity, no mocking stare, no attempt to intimidate, felt like an odd courtesy. That night, she dreamed of wide plains and the wind in her hair, and woke startled by the tenderness of it. Language remained a barrier, but gestures spoke. When the summer heat became oppressive, one guard quietly left a bucket of cool water near the garden where several women worked. No speech, no explanation. Another day, a young Texan, barely older than the women, awkwardly offered chewing gum, holding it out like a peace token. Most refused, unsure if it was safe, but one girl accepted, chewing shyly as the cowboy grinned. The small scene sparked whispered debates later. Were these gestures genuine, or tricks to weaken their resolve? Yet the walls built by fear had begun, almost invisibly, to crack. One evening, the women were asked to demonstrate origami to a curious guard. Paper was scarce, but they folded what scraps they could. The man watched with quiet fascination as cranes and boats took shape. He tried clumsily to mimic them, tearing the fragile sheet with his rough hands, and laughed softly at his failure. The sound was startling, not the harsh laugh of an enemy, but something almost boyish. Keiko found herself smiling before she could stop it. The room went still for a heartbeat, as if everyone felt the fragile weight of that moment. Then someone coughed, and life resumed. But something unspoken had shifted. Time passed in this strange rhythm. Work, watchfulness, small exchanges that neither side seemed fully prepared for. Propaganda, the dark stories that had traveled with the women from Japan, lost some of its power. Americans were not savages. They were maddeningly human. They teased each other, they sweated in the sun, they seemed proud but not needlessly cruel. The realization was not simple relief. It was disorienting, even painful. Hate had been armor, and without it, fear felt naked. August came heavy and electric. Rumors swept the camp. Japan had surrendered. Some women refused to believe it, clinging to hope that their homeland had held on. Others wept quietly in their bunks, not just for defeat but for brothers and fathers likely lost. Keiko sat with the news like a stone in her chest. The photograph of her brother, worn soft at the edges, seemed suddenly unbearably fragile. Was he alive? Did surrender mean he could come home, or that he had died for nothing? The Americans didn't gloat as she expected. There was a muted stillness among the guards, a respect for the gravity of the moment. One evening, as the sun bled red over the plains, a cowboy rode slowly past the barracks, hat tipped low. He didn't speak. The gesture was simple, but Keiko felt tears rise. Her enemy had acknowledged her loss without words. It was more than she had thought possible. Soon after, orders came. Repatriation would begin. The women would be sent back across the ocean to a Japan forever changed. The camp buzzed with preparations, inventories taken, names checked. For some, leaving was relief. For others, it was a wrenching severing from the strange safety they had found here. Keiko walked the perimeter one last time, her gaze on the sky that seemed to go on forever. She thought of the first day, the terror in the trucks, the horses waiting instead of chains. So much of what she had believed about enemies, about dignity, had been quietly undone. On the final morning, the women lined up to depart. The guards stood by, more solemn than usual. One cowboy, the same man who had steadied her horse that first day, approached Keiko as she climbed into the truck. He didn't speak Japanese, and she didn't know enough English, but he took off his hat in a slow, respectful motion. Keiko, startled, bowed deeply. Around her, other women followed suit. It was not gratitude for captivity. It was acknowledgement of humanity in the midst of war. As the trucks pulled away, the women looked back through the dust at the camp receding behind them. Some wept quietly. Some stared ahead, unblinking. Keiko held her brother's photograph and felt an ache she could not name. Grief, yes, but also the weight of unexpected mercy. She had come here expecting to lose her selfhood. She left knowing it had somehow survived. Behind the barbed wire, the cowboys watched until the convoy disappeared over the horizon. For them, too, something unspoken lingered. War had drawn lines between nations, but for a season beneath the Texas sky, those lines had blurred in quiet, human ways. Keiko turned for one last look as the camp vanished into the shimmering heat. In that instant, she understood that the war had not only been fought with bullets and flags, but with ideas of who deserved dignity and who did not. Here, far from home, a small fracture had opened in that idea. It would follow her back across the Pacific, haunting and changing her. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she carried one truth she had not known before. Even in the ruins of defeat, compassion can appear where you least expect it, and it can change everything.